What's going on, guys? As weird as it may seem, today I've got something very different to what I'd normally do. If you're here because of specifically this video, hello to you. This is predominantly a gaming channel with stuff like this. I failed. I failed fucking miserably. I ain't failed yet! I didn't fail! And this.
Yeah, there we go. I was a little bit scared of him exploding all over me.
And sometimes even this.
I literally got called a bootleg Irishman on fucking St. Patrick's Day. I was fucking...
So to you, my returning subscribers, if you're watching, this is not a complete direction change from my usual stuff, just more of an augmentation. Because in case you hadn't noticed, the world's got some problems. Now, I'm a huge believer that education will cure all, or at least go to the greatest length to make the world a better place. So, since I've been doing some digging and some reading around the subject of the video, I thought, since I'm frankly a little too much of a shut-in to go and protest, that I'd use my critiquing strength to try and raise some awareness for the subject in question. Which, of course, is the moral compass of the Black Lives Matter movement, and more specifically, the reaction to it from a Mr. Joel Patrick.
Let's talk about Black Lives Matter.
Now, there are plenty of individuals plying their trade in the realms of Black Lives Matter skepticism, so why am I picking on Joel specifically? Well, Joel represents a particularly dangerous part of the discourse around the debate here. The debate in question being, is Black Lives Matter a force for good? It's not just him, but he is a perfect encapsulation of what I like to call the skeptical statistician. Let's be clear, pretty much every criticism of the movement can be chalked up to someone missing the point, but when numbers are thrown in, things get a bit dangerous. Not only do stats offer a certain credibility where arguments are concerned, but when, like in Joel's case, they're hideously wrong or misinterpreted, they offer a dangerous opportunity for the misinformed to bury their heads in the sand. And this is proved vehemently by the comments section of his video. Joel's made a fair few videos talking about how wrong Black Lives Matter actually are, and how being black and right-wing is perfectly acceptable, by bombarding random students on the street with vague questions and counting their unpreparedness for a debate as a win. He's a real stand-up guy who's not afraid to say it how it is, despite how it is being a gross misunderstanding of black history in America and an even grosser misunderstanding of how to interpret statistics. You see, Joel, things don't just change because we'd like them to. Yes, I'm aware of how hypocritical you think that sounds, but just bear with me, alright? Another big problem with Joel is, and I'm gonna get some hate for this, he's the black guy who denounces Black Lives Matter. If we learned anything from Patrick Moore of Greenpeace and how he became the climate denier's poster boy for a while, it's that the counter-argument from the same side is very strong. Joel offers a sobering validation for people who already agree with him about Black Lives Matter, which, considering pretty much his entire video is full of falsehoods and misinterpreted statistics, is fucking wonderful! If only his points contained any factual basis, I'd probably take them on board, but they don't. So let's take a look at just why he, and pretty much all of his comments section, are so blatantly incorrect. My source list is gonna be in the description, by the way. And of course, I'll link Joel's video down there too, because I need you to be sure I'm not misrepresenting him. Anyway, Joel Patrick's video. I was debating on whether to just go through it chronologically and debunk each point in order, but that would get a bit messy. He makes the same few general points, such as there is no problem of racism in America, Black Lives Matter are nothing but a bunch of rioting assholes out to make a quick steal off the back of a murder, that racial profiling is part of the police's job, and the big one,
Black Lives Matter cares nothing for black lives.
Now, this last point, the one we'll address first, bear with me, seems like the most disingenuous one to make, because it's obviously wrong. Joel uses arguments such as, most black people are killed by other black people, what about Planned Parenthood and fatherless families, what about rap music?
And statistically speaking, the issue that is killing the most black people is black people. 94% of black people that are killed by black people.
Now, a minor nitpick. I've done the research on FBI databases myself, and it's actually 88% of black homicides are caused by other black people. But that's fine, Joel. Just spout out figures and don't cite any sources. I'm sure you're right about everything anyway. Where has this fucking graph come from? So, yeah. He throws out a lot of examples where black lives are actually in danger, and on premise, this is a conversation that needs to be had. A disproportionate amount of black people are killed by other black people, and it is a problem. But the way Joel views it is wrong, or at least incomplete. He's unwittingly stumbled upon the consequences of historically founded systemic racism, and it's his insistence on simply viewing statistics as the sole indicator of a problem that's made him miss this. Now, hold it right there, I hear you say. Systemic racism? Isn't that just an excuse thrown out by the left? Isn't that not real? Well, allow me to explain. What is systemic racism? Honestly, you shouldn't just take my word for it. I'll link you towards some better explanations in the description, but here's a quick synopsis just to bring some context to just why black people are considered by the wider scholarship to be under the cosh. It's the common belief that since the fall of slavery and then the introduction of the Civil Rights Act, that racism has simply gone away. Of course, there isn't a great deal of legislation enforcing racist ideology, but as I stated earlier, Joel, change doesn't just happen. And problems and consequences don't just go away because we did the good thing, which I'd argue to be the baseline thing, but that's for another day. I mean, use your common sense. When the slaves were freed, do you think they were distributed equally throughout the societal hierarchy? Of course not. People don't just stop being racist or stop viewing black people as beneath them because of some Emancipation Act. They were placed at the bottom of the ladder, and after the passing of the Jim Crow laws brought about by the deep racist discomfort of the former white slave owners, they were kept down there through means such as denying them sale of property, denying them bank loans, or even granting them loans with higher interest rates than white loans. Their prison sentences were and are longer. They weren't allowed to stand in juries. The list goes on. To put it bluntly, the system put black people down and continued to keep them down with non-resolutive amendments and other forms of racial prejudice, such as imposed apartheid that persisted even after the civil rights movement. Even if we adopt Joel's way of thinking and assume that prejudice against black people ended with Dr. King, that still only happened about 50 to 60 years ago. And this is all ignoring the other indirect forms of prejudice towards black people, such as the government's insistence on turning a blind eye to the KKK, which exists to this day when they refuse to label them a terrorist organization. So let's look at this from a context of common sense. Black people were denied economic rights for a very long time, denied property, denied money, only able to apply for the lowest paid jobs, and since the greatest economic contributor towards white wealth is inheritance, how were black people supposed to do anything with the nothing they were dealt? You see, when a people is denied something as integral to our current society as money, you'll find that it's easy to manipulate their lives. If black people could only afford the cheapest houses, and you control the housing market, it'd be pretty easy to segregate them by simply picking a neighborhood you wanted them to live in and pricing only those houses to fit their price range. This is how segregation goes beyond apartheid, and this is where the ghettos paradigm was established. Even if you proceed under the assumption that racism ended with Dr. King, which it didn't, how do you expect all of that economic disadvantage to just fix itself in a mere 2 generations of apparent freedom? The word in which the quotation marks are doing some fucking legwork. That is systemic racism. The consequences of our very racist past, which I'm sure no one will disagree, happened. There are many, many more points to be made akin to this one, but you understand now, right? That just because rights were granted in the 60s, the consequences of the absence of these rights didn't just fucking vanish overnight. And this is something that Black Lives Matter are devoted to uprooting, if you paid attention to them. Doing some actual research into the root causes of these statistics and the party you're criticising would be a much more useful method of scrutiny, Joel, as opposed to the bullshit surface level criticism that offers nothing constructive, just, you're wrong! You're wrong! So anyway, after that brief background and the minimal level of understanding achieved, it's time to address Joel's point. The Black Lives Matter not doing anything to stop the black people killing other black people point. I picked my demonstrative example of systemic racism quite carefully, you'll see. The specific point Joel's addressing, and his supporting evidence, highlight that what he's talking about is black on black crime. He, like many others before him, is looking at the numbers and saying, look, there, see, it's clear. Black people kill each other more than any other type of people. It's a black problem. Now, if Joel had done just a smidgen of research, he'd realise just how incorrect this analysis is. Numbers mean nothing without context. You need to delve into the root causes of them to understand the problem, and his analysis is, frankly, very telling of the framework from which he's viewing it. He, and those who think like him, believe that the issue is an inherently black problem in that it's caused by black people, affects black people, and therefore should be solved by black people. Which is an entirely flawed narrative because It isn't a black problem. If it was, you wouldn't see similar situations occurring in communities of different racial demographics, and you would see it in different black demographics. Let's take my country as an example.
When both the perpetrator and the victims are white, race suddenly becomes unimportant. There is one limited sense in which race may be important. You could argue that only a very particular demographic of young black boys, only at a very particular stage in their lives, feel a degree of psychological self-hatred or contempt for themselves that they project onto other people who most remind them of themselves. However, the black-on-black violence paradigm, so-called, is never used in that way as a kind of psychological self-hatred model. It's used to give the public essentially the ridiculous impression that black school teachers, black doctors, black lawyers, black Premier League footballers, my grandmother, David Adjaye, Oswald Boateng, are all sort of an equal risk of violent crime.
Who you just saw there was rapper, scholar, and historian Akala in his famous interview with Piers Morgan discussing the effective ways of viewing youth violence in London communities. And his points are astoundingly simple when you actually listen. Despite the insistence by a large number of commentators, media outlets, and others, including Joel, of viewing this pattern of violence as a black problem, otherwise known as racializing the problem, Akala argues that when considering that similar patterns of violence existed in white communities elsewhere, the problem is obviously not a racial one. If these patterns were racial, why is there no mention or debate of white-on-white crime? It's probably because the peddlers of this myth have no reason to do so, since it's not white people they're looking to demonize. This pattern of violence doesn't manifest in any other sub-demographic of black people, such as age, gender, socioeconomic status, etc., so clearly the racial element isn't the problem. And viewing it this way devalues the analysis of actual causal links between the two discussed communities, which was poverty. Yep, that's what linked them. So it's almost as if patterns of violence have nothing to do with race, do they, Joel? Why am I saying all this? Well, truthfully, in response to Joel's video, this highlights just how ridiculous it is to categorize the problem in the way Joel does. He's viewing it through the wrong lens. It's not a black problem, but rather a cultural phenomenon cultivated by the many contributing factors of systemic racism that create almost the perfect storm for people who wish to demonize the black community or ignore their plight altogether. Piece together one part segregation and a lot of poverty, as we've just seen, and there you have it. Perfect conditions for these statistical patterns to manifest, with very little time and opportunity for the situation to remedy itself. Sure, reparations would have sped the process up, but, well, that's been a really uncomfortable fucking conversation in America now, hasn't it? And poverty being linked to violent crime is kinda obvious. When living by the rules has landed you with not nearly enough income to do, well, even the basics such as eat, drink, have a home, it's unsurprising that faith in those rules would dwindle, and that you try to break them just to live. Would you rather starve or steal? What if you needed to feed your family? You're gonna need more than a loaf of bread, but stealing can be hard and scary, so you better arm yourself to get your point across. What about other means of generating money? The drugs trade, for example? Hell, that's dangerous. You better get yourself a gang for security. But oh no, turf wars have started. They want you to kill the rival gangs or they'll kill you. All you wanted to do was feed your starving family. And this is just one scenario. It's not a stretch to synthesize more. And isn't it amazing that all you needed to do, Joel, was just a tiny amount of research to find this out? But of course, it was easier to ignore all of that just to voice your hideously misguided opinion, wasn't it, Joel? So we agree. It's not a black issue. It's a poverty issue. And racially biased over-policing and under-policing of these neighbourhoods doesn't help. The system Joel loves to lord over in his video created the problem and continues to make it worse by punishing victims of this prejudice way too harshly, like a school bully would. Even economic decisions such as underfunding schools in poorer communities contributes to this cycle of misery. If a school doesn't possess the resources to teach these kids and steer them in the right direction, or if the community flat out can't afford it, we see a much greater likelihood of these kids winding up in jail. A study reported by the University of Edinburgh claims that excluded children are exceptionally more likely to end up in prison, whilst also discovering that children from poorer communities were much less likely to be tolerated and were therefore excluded much more frequently. And which demographic are disproportionately affected by poverty? You know. Black Lives Matter have openly stated that tackling systemic racism is their main goal, one step at a time. I know it seems like they're only focusing on the police brutality issue, but to be honest, this is logically the only place you can start. Because if you can't even protest for your rights without getting your head smashed in legally, then how the hell are you going to bring about change? Joe loves to show off his 5-second clip of some guy's in some kind of conflict. See, they're all rioters. Look at this rioting. Look at the bad people. But here's a snippet of a 5-minute montage of the police instigating violence towards peaceful protesters, or even sometimes random civilians and journalists, courtesy of Cody Johnston of Some More News. While we're on the subject of riots, it's time to address the next point on the list of wrongness that Joel states. He claims riots don't solve anything. So let's get one thing clear here. I don't condone violence, especially towards the innocent. Riots aren't something I typically consider when I'm thinking of radical political change to a broken system. Who am I kidding? Of course I do. Hang on, no. Again, that's not strictly true. The only time I'm ever prompted to wish for a violent stand is when I see it from the other side. I want to defend these poor people we've seen brutalized by the police, and if that makes me violent, nasty, unnecessarily radical, then so be it. Rioting is, on the face of it, pretty violent and ugly, but that doesn't make it unnecessary. The suffragettes did it for women's rights, and the Stonewall movement did it for LGBTQ rights. And those aforementioned communities have been treated a little better since, though there's obviously still a lot more work to be done. The thing that Joel and all his buddies get wrong is that when they see a riot, which, let's be clear, is defined by a big mass of people marching against a certain issue with some violence thrown in, usually towards property, not human life, but let's ignore that for Joel's sake. They don't question why maybe it's happening. As much as it would support your points, Joel, people aren't typically sadistic and violent when pressed. This is what happens when built-up anger that's been simmering for decades is brought to the boil. Instead of condemning these people for their means, why not try to understand what brought them to this? Because maybe, if everyone listened, these people wouldn't have to shout in the worst way possible to be heard. As Dr. King himself stated, a riot is the language of the unheard. Joel characterizing Black Lives Matter as rioters is a disingenuous dismissal of all of the peaceful marches they've been on. Black Lives Matter wasn't founded after the death of George Floyd. It's been working on uprooting systemic racism from America for years now. Its rise to greater prominence can be attributed to enough people being outraged by a police officer feeling it necessary to kneel on a black man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. But this is far from the first time a black man has been unjustly killed. People have been pissed for years now, and this was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Black Lives Matter have been peacefully protesting the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, and many others for years now. Hell, most of the George Floyd protests this year have been peaceful protests, but you didn't mention those, did you, Joel? And most of these riots started as peaceful protests, and then descended into what could be construed as a riot thanks to instigation by the police, or by known white supremacist groups. Yeah, that's right. White supremacists have been going to Black Lives Matter protests with the specific intention of lighting the fire, as it were. Black Lives Matter leaders typically condemn violence caused at their protests, and the overwhelming majority of these protests have been peaceful. It's ridiculous to consider otherwise, unless, of course, these facts are inconvenient to your wider point, Joel, who, in his video, by the way, refuses to condemn obvious causal factors of these riots, like racial profiling. Now, I know we just went over why black people shouldn't be considered any more violent than white people, but honestly, Joel spends the lion's share of his video essentially justifying racial profiling by the police and the statistics that support him, so it's probably for the best to go in on him the most for this one. Joel can be heard saying things like,
innocent black men as a whole are not killed statistically by the police. That is not true. It just isn't happening. Police are more likely to shoot a white person that they pull over than a black person. 91% of people shot and killed by the police, regardless of their skin color, are, guess what? Armed. See, police profile. It's part of their job. They profile based on people that fit certain descriptions because, statistically speaking, those people pose the largest risk to them.
Prepare yourself. So the first 2 points are kinda similar and deserve similar rebuttals. White and black people are shot by the police, we agree there. But to say there are more white victims of police shootings is One of the places that Joel and his compadres are consistently wrong is their refusal to view statistics in comparison with the population demographic of America. 76% are white, whereas only 13% are black. Yet, black people are killed by the police at a rate of 31 per million, as opposed to only 13 per million for white people. More white people have been killed by the police, yes, but black people are killed by the police at a rate way more than twice the amount. We're not talking about a small scale that could be easily palmed off as a statistical outlier. If the system truly were non-biased, you'd see whites killed by the police at the same rate, which we don't. Now, I'm obviously not saying I want more white victims of police shooting. Don't be ridiculous, you tiny little trolls. In an ideal world, no one would be shot by the police. What I'm saying is that in the world where police shootings do occur, there are too many black victims of police shootings to be able to comfortably dismiss any claims of racial bias. Hence, Black Lives Matter being pissed that so many black people that may have been committing a smaller crime that a white person would have just been arrested and lightly sentenced for are being shot. I'm sorry, murdered. Joel insists that our justice system is working fine. You commit a crime, you get punished. Just suck it up, Buttercup, and take your justice. He's adamant that if you surrender, you don't get shot, which... Okay, I've been civil up until now. Fuck off, Joel! I'll briefly address Joel's point about the armed criminal statistics before I get too carried away here. Armed is a bit of an umbrella term. Armed doesn't mean we're shooting at the police. As we've discussed, the areas in which criminal activity and poverty are rife, it can be quite appealing to some to carry a weapon around for the purposes of self-protection. And, you know, it's not like it's impossible to get hold of a gun in America now, is it? And the claim that carrying a weapon justifies the police being scared of you, and by extension the shooting of you, is easily debunked when you consider the amount of white people flaunting their weapons uncriticised at the anti-mask protests earlier this year. Were any of them shot and killed? If a suspect is arrested and or flat out shot and later discovered to have a weapon on them, they'll be considered armed, which, again, didn't mean they used it against the police. Though it's a good thing the police are above planting a weapon on someone to justify their actions. Go away, cited source! The fact is, really, that citing armed shooting victims is, once again, a completely catastrophic missing of the fucking point. Seriously, you think we're all saying black people who shot at the police should be acquitted just because they're black? No! If you listen to anything anyone has said, you'd know that we're more concerned with the unarmed victims, or the surrendering victims, or the victims who ran away. Those like Breonna Taylor, who was literally asleep in her own fucking house when the police broke in and shot her. Hundreds of victims spanning out over the last several years that have been unnecessarily murdered by the police, that all seem to share one thing in common. Their skin colour. You see, this isn't just a question of isolated cases, Joel. Most of the perpetrators of these police shootings were either completely let off or fired for what they did. Not tried before a jury, not even arrested or questioned. They got away with murder. And it always seems to be against the black victims when that justice machine you lauded over, Joel, goes missing. And when it is white victims that are wrongly shot by the police, guess who's there to condemn it? Black Lives Matter. You see, even when a white person suffers the same fate as all of those black people we've been talking about, Black Lives Matter is still there to show support. Now, about Joel's racial profiling remarks. He insists that because the statistics justify it, it's okay for the police to negatively assume that black people are more worthy of stopping or profiling as criminals. As we've pointed out, statistics aren't just something you can slap on an argument to make it valid. You have to understand why they are the way they are, Joel. He proceeds to cite more numbers, state more numbers, he cites nothing, and insists that the most likely criminal in America will be a black male. Now, I can't refute that statement, but once again, Joel, you've missed the entire fucking point. Firstly, this doesn't justify shooting the criminal as quickly as the police do in response to unarmed resistance. Secondly, crime statistics around black people can and have easily developed into a vicious circle. Crime AI often becomes antithetical to solving any police bias, as it draws from previous crime statistics to predict which areas need policing. Black drivers are pulled over by the police 4 times as much as white drivers, despite the statistics stating that white drivers are more likely to have something dangerous on them. And when crime AI sees this, it doesn't add to the bias itself, but repeats it. So Joel's numbers, while possibly being statistically correct, could very well have been, and almost certainly were, conflated. And lastly, this is still no reason to harass black people in the street, Joel. Root causes for statistics, Joel. Root causes. Gods, I feel like I'm going in circles here. The final point I'll make on Joel's racial profiling defense is this. Even with racial profiling and crime AI putting more police into areas of crime, I've got some other statistics that prove this solution pointless, which Akala brings up in that fateful interview.
To Britain and the United States and other places.
Carla, can I ask, because it was the particular point that Alex had made his really important intervention on, prison sentences and increased police presence and numbers. What effect might they have?
On reducing crime in the long term, virtually zero. A good friend of mine, Dr. Baz Drasinger, did a study all around the world where she looked at prison systems and incarceration all around the world. She found not one country in which tougher sentences in and of themselves did anything to reduce crime. In fact, in many ways, we can just look across the water to the United States. They may make it worse for reasons that are entirely obvious.
Hear that? Actual research, Joel. Increasing numbers of police have been observed to do nothing for reducing crime numbers in the long term. Early intervention by youth centres and church groups does. It's almost as if nurturing kids and educating them makes them less likely to lash out at the system and its beneficiaries. It's almost as if there are usable solutions out there to combat all this crime you hate that don't involve the risk of death. Defending the police when they've been obviously flawed, and keep in mind I'm referring to the whole institution, is simply not helping. Black Lives Matter are not perfect, but they understand the problem, and the solutions needed to resolve it. Real, pragmatic solutions that would save so many of these black lives you claim to care about, Joel. Assuming all black men are criminals is just plain ridiculous and obviously damaging, so defending this? I won't condone that. Like the great hero himself once said.
Thought the punishment usually came after the crime.
And that's all I have to say. So, it's obvious now that Joel's got this wrong. Like, tremendously wrong. Aside from his arguments being wrong, his way of conducting them is, well, I'll be honest, even worse. And I know it's not just him, but unfortunately, he chose to stand in the limelight, and here are the consequences. It's his general ignorance and lack of solutions that stick in the craw the most. He highlights many a problem, and yet refuses to offer solutions, such as claiming fatherlessness is likely to lead to a life of crime.
Crime also follows fatherlessness.
He's almost making a valid point, but then offers nothing to combat it. Black Lives Matter telling the bad fathers to stop being bad fathers will solve nothing, as opposed to campaigning for educational reform that teaches kids about being a parent and having safe sex, putting your faith in their goals so they don't wind up unbound after school's out and can only fill the void by having a family they're not prepared for. These are just a few off the top of my head. He brutally mishandles statistics and is genuinely convinced that numbers, results, are all you need to identify a problem. Yet, care to explain why they happen? Oh, they just do? The ignorance doesn't stop there either. His general level of discourse aside, there's a truly shocking moment when, having previously denounced using sweeping generalizations,
That's a sweeping generalization.
he says this.
And for little white kids, that music is just music that they bob their head to. But for little black kids, that music is a lifestyle.
And I'm sat there like, I thought generalizations were bad, Joel. Not to mention racist ones. His whole ethos of racism denial bleeds through the entire video, taking the form of pattern denial, or claiming Derek Chauvin was a murderer, not a racist, and that police brutality is an issue, but Black Lives Matter should just keep their noses out. Who else is going to solve it, Joel? Black Lives Matter aren't crying out for attention from the masses. They're demanding change from up top. Just because you may view things as not a black issue, they're still an issue, Joel. And actually, at the end of all this, Joel does offer one solution. Conformity.
But we could start with limiting our interactions with the police. If you do not escalate the situation, you will not be killed.
And in an ideal world, he's right. But that's not where we live, Joel. Black people get harassed on the street, minding their own business, not committing a crime. They're pulled over more than white people by a ridiculous margin. Joel himself attests to having been pulled over 14 times in the last year. What crimes were you committing, Joel, to get pulled over that much? You should limit your interactions with the police, Joel. And if for some strange reason you think that's normal, I'm a white British cis male who's been driving for 4 years now, And do you know how many times I've been pulled over? Once. You've been pulled over 14 times more than me in 1 year than I have in my entire driving life. But the veil of racism denial from you is so grotesquely thick that you refuse to admit that this is a problem that needs addressing. Conformity might seem like the way forward, but conformity wasn't enough to save the lives of so many black victims who were approached by the police. And that's who we're mad about. Those who obeyed the rules. Those who were peacefully protesting, those who surrendered, those who ran away, and got shot anyway. So, to summarize this video, I would say this, to Joel, to those who agree with him, to anyone out there who may be listening, there is a problem. Denialism isn't a new thing, and it isn't limited to just this issue. It's founded in a deep discomfort around change, around accepting that to make the world better, we might have to change how we look at it. Change is a granular process, and there's no fix-all solution to the problem of systemic racism in America. But there is something we can all do to kickstart the process. Listen, educate ourselves, understand where these problems started, because through understanding a problem at its roots, we can finally begin to work towards a solution. Will we stop crime and death? Of course not. But we can stop inequality. We can stop poverty. It's going to hurt us, and there are issues like police brutality that need to be solved first so we can exact stronger change higher up. But the result is a fairer land for all. We've taken the first steps, Black Lives Matter, towards changing our society for the better. We can't stop now. As the Buddha once stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm sorry, the two biggest mistakes you can make on a journey are not starting and not finishing. So, despite all the backlash, all the hatred, we must persevere. We must do all we can, whether it's marching on the streets, pushing politicians to breaking point for change, or doing something comparatively small like me, and publishing a rant video that might do some educating. We can do this, so let's keep going. Oh, and fuck everything Joel Patrick says. Bye!